Greetings, Helldivers! The day of the anticipated gigantic patch has finally arrived, and boy are we in for a treat. I think this is probably the thickest patch notes we've gotten to date, and from looking through the notes myself, I reckon that apart from a handful of balance tweaks, everything in here is a buff. Our weapons got buffed across the board, our support weapons got buffed, our stratagems got buffed, and our enemies got some well-deserved balancing. For this video, I'm not going to just read the notes out to you. There are a lot of balance changes, tweaks and improvements across so many things that it would make for a way too long-winded video that doesn't really add much. Instead, I'm going to give you a summary of the changes and the implications of how these changes will affect the game overall. I think that would make for a much more interesting video. If you want to read the notes for yourself, I'll share a link in the description, or you can go to the official Helldivers 2 Discord and read them there. So, without further ado, hold on to your Hellpods and let's get it on. Starting with some general changes. The core mechanic of partial damage, where our weapon's armor penetration matches an enemy's armor value, has been tweaked. Previously, partial damage would only deal 50% of its listed damage values, but now that has been increased to 65%. This represents a 30% increase to partial damage. This bump in damage has implications when it comes to our overall combat effectiveness, especially with our primary weapons. I'll elaborate more as we go down the notes. Secondly, Helldivers now only receive 50% extra damage if they take a headshot instead of 100% more. This change makes it so that we don't end up taking spike damage from peeking out to take shots and simply reduces the instances of dying without a counter. In return, however, we will be taking slightly more damage to other body parts depending on the area we are hit. Next, moving on to our primary and secondary weapon balancing. If I were to condense this entire section of patch notes into a single sentence, it would be: our weapons have received improvements in both base and durable damage, an increase in total magazines carried, and an increase to its stagger force. This statement is pretty much true for the majority of weapons listed, but I'm going to point out some of the more interesting changes that have caught my attention. The Breaker Spray and Pray now has a duckbill muzzle, which causes its shots to be much more horizontal rather than vertical. This change in shot pattern means it will be much more effective at dealing with swarms of enemies, as now less of your pellets are going to be flying over them. It has also received a very generous 25% damage increase to accompany this change. The Explosive Crossbow has received a 50% increase to its explosion radius, and a whopping 200 damage boost to its explosive damage, picking it up from 150 damage to 350. This change is phenomenal. As someone who was really gutted when they reduced my crossbow to nothing in prior patches, with this update, it lives up to its power fantasy of lobbing artillery shells at enemies. A well-placed bolt can wipe out a group of lesser enemies in a single shot, and it is no slouch at dealing with bigger targets like Devastators and even Bile Spewers too. The Eruptor has received its Shrapnel back. In return for reduced explosive damage, the Eruptor's shot will now explode on impact, similar to firing a Frag Grenade. As part of this buff, it has also received an increase to its explosive blast radius. Just looking at the Shrapnel projectile numbers, it would seem like firing into a swarm or group of peasant enemies will be devastating. Both the Diligence and the Counter Sniper have received substantial buffs to its base damage. The Diligence got a 32% increase in base damage, bumping it up from 125 to 165, and a durable damage increase from 32 to 42. Meanwhile, the Counter Sniper got a huge 43% increase in damage, boosting its damage up from 140 to 200 damage, along with a more than doubling its durable damage from 14 to 50. These changes make picking off key targets significantly easier, and if you were a fan of the DMRs before, you are certainly going to enjoy using them now in this patch. Both the Torture and the Crisper, our Flamethrower weapons, have received a 50% buff to its damage, and have had their flame mechanics reverted to before the Escalation of Freedom update. Importantly, the AP value of these weapons have been increased from 3 to 4, and are now the only primary and secondary weapons, minus the grenade pistol, to have medium 2 penetration. I know not yet how this will translate into my loadout crafting, but I'm excited about the possibilities. Moving on to our support weapons. A key change that has been made with this patch is the classification of anti-tank weapons, especially for our rocket-based armaments. Now, anti-tank weapons are split into 3 different categories: strong and reliable, strong, and less strong. Strong and reliable weapons include the Spear and Recoilless Rifle. These weapons have the characteristics of not really needing to aim accurately, and as long as it makes contact with the target, it will more likely than not be eliminated in one shot. Strong weapons include the likes of the expendable anti-tanks and the Quasar Cannon. These weapons have the potential to also one-shot armored enemies as long as they are hit in the weak spot, like charges in the head or the visor of the Hulk. Otherwise, they will need 2 shots to put them down. These weapons basically stay the same as they were before. And finally, for less strong weapons, this includes the Commando and the Exosuit rockets, typically weapons that have numerous shots available. Weapons that fall into this category will require several shots to bring down armored enemies, but depending on your aim, you can still bring down enemies like Hulks in one shot if you hit them just right. Before I go into the rest of the support weapons on the list, a global change that has been made to armored enemies is a reduction to their armor tier. Practically all enemies that were classified as Heavy 1 or had AP 5 armor have been bumped down to Medium 2 or AP 4. As a result, many of our support weapons can now handle what were previously heavily armored enemies. This includes both the Chargers, Bile Titans, Hulks, and Impalers. So, if a weapon had AP 4 before, like the autocannon, it can now take on these enemies with partial damage, which has been buffed. Now, for the support weapons. The grenade launcher has received more ammo overall and has had its explosion radius increased slightly. The laser cannon has had its recoil completely removed and now cools down slightly faster, a great quality of life improvement for the weapon. The arc thrower has had its range increased from 35 meters to 55 meters, a 57% increase. Not only that, but repeated hits on the same target now build up a stun effect that now also chains to more enemies, on top of having its durable damage doubled from 50 to 100. Really happy to see these changes on the arc thrower. The Railgun has also received a ginormous buff to its durable damage, jumping from 60 to 225. Fully overcharging damage has also been increased from 150% to 250%. Now, I'm not really a user of the Railgun, but just doing some math off the top of my head, these changes basically translates into the Railgun hitting about half as hard or maybe a third as hard as the Orbital Rail Cannon Strike. I think it's finally going to live up to its power fantasy with this change. The Commando has received one of the few nerfs in this patch as a result of the anti-tank reclassification. It can no longer destroy automaton fabricators in a single shot. However, because fabricators now have health, you are able to use 2 rockets to bring it down instead. The Flamethrower, like the primary and secondary flame weapons, has also received a similar treatment. It has had its damage increased by 33% and its armor penetration has increased from 3 to 4, being able to set heavy enemies alight as well. As a result of the changes to heavy units armor, the AMR, heavy machine gun and autocannon can now take down Chargers, Bile Titans, Hulks and Impalers. Oh, and the AMR got a 25% boost in durable damage from 135 to 180. Nice. That about sums it up for our support weapons. Overall, these changes, together with the heavy unit armor nerf, has essentially opened up our support weapon loadout selections. Previously, we'd always have to need something that could deal with AP check of either medium 2 or AP 4 for bots, and heavy 1 or AP 5 for bugs. This enforced a specific combination of weapons which led to a meta developing which became stale very quickly. Now, because the majority of support weapons are at least medium 2 penetration, you can bring a bunch of different combinations to deal with enemies without feeling like you're gimping yourself or your team. You want to man fight a Hulk with a flamethrower? You can do it. You want to challenge a Charger with an autocannon head-on? Bring it on. Finally, we have some changes to a couple of our grenades. The Frag Grenade has received a bunch of buffs, increasing its explosive radius and damage, as well as the number of grenades you can carry from 4 to 5 and the refills you get from 2 to 3. These are solid buffs to improve its use as a flexible crowd control weapon that affords you many opportunities to use it, so use it liberally. The buff to the Thermite Grenade is probably one of the most insane number tweaks I've seen in any game. On top of reducing the time it takes for the Thermite to explode and how long it takes the Thermite to ignite in the first place, the Thermite Grenade has received a 2000% damage increase. Yes, 2000. This is not a bug nor a typo. It can quite literally one-shot every enemy except maybe for Factory Striders if you place them just right. The only downside is that now you can only carry 3 of them instead of 4. This change single-handedly opens up our loadout choices even more. Previously, you had to depend on your support weapons or orbitals to deal with heavy units. With this change, you can now take a supply pack and thermites and you'll be set for dealing with heavy units at a limited range. It might not always be the best choice, but the fact you can afford to take more crowd control weapons like the Stalwart or HMG and have the utility stratagems like smokes and EMS without feeling useless against charges and the like is huge. This is honestly one of the most significant changes Arrowhead has made from a build crafter's point of view, since it enables even more choice and decision making about how you like to craft your loadout. That is all for our weapons and a huge change to our enemy armor as well. If the patch notes ended here, it would already be a huge win in my eyes, simply because of how much more freedom we get from being able to play around with our loadouts. But that's not the case. Arrowhead has been cooking, and cooking hard with these changes to gameplay mechanics, enemies, and stratagems too. First off, I like to mention now that we can hold up to 4 emotes because we have an Emote Wheel feature. You can stick more emotes in the wheel via the armory. Next, let's talk about enemy changes. As mentioned earlier, Automaton Fabricators now have a health mechanic attached to it, in addition to its existing destruction system of throwing explosives into the vents. This essentially means that weapons with high armor penetration can still destroy them, but may take multiple hits to do so. Beyond the Commando, I'm not exactly sure what other weapons will be able to break a Fabricator that doesn't involve hurling explosive into the vents. We'll need to test to find out. For enemy units, a single sentence summary about all the changes would be the following. All heavy units have had their armor reduced from tier 5 to tier 4, and most enemies now have a lower health pool while being less oppressive with their attacks. Key changes that would make you jump for joy are: Berzerkers have had their health pool for their head and body reduced, and their belly is now a weak spot. Previously, the glowing red part was only there for show and didn't have any multipliers attached to it. All Devastator bots have had their main health pool reduced and will now flinch when hit. This is actually a huge change because now suppressive fire will actually do something to them, allowing you to fire back without constantly cowering behind cover. This next change to Rocket Devastators helped to further support that point. Rocket Devastators and gunships now have a limited number of rockets which you can see disappear when spent. To this, they now have the reload mechanic, and the collision size of the rockets are now smaller. Rocket Devastators needing to reload was something that made sense given the realism that Arrowhead wanted to pursue, so seeing this change implemented is excellent. Chargers have had some substantial tweaks made to them. In addition to their armor changes, their butt now has a lower health pool and is also less durable, meaning it takes less durable damage, which also means most of our weapons will proportionately deal more damage since base damage tends to be higher than durable. Chargers that have had their armor blown off and their squishy orange flesh exposed take 300% more damage to these areas. This means if you want to conserve ammo, or if you missed your shot and only managed to break its armor with a rocket, you still have an effective way of killing them as well. It was always so weird that having their guts exposed didn't do any more damage than before, but it's good to see that this changes here. In addition to that, chargers will also charge less often now, but their charges are more powerful. Hunters and Scavengers have had their health pools reduced. Hunters now have 160 health instead of 175, and Scavengers have 60 instead of 80. On the surface, you might see this and think, oh, that's nice. Or, these enemies were already squishy before, I don't get why they lowered their health ever so slightly. But as someone who is in the midst of trying to put together a working breakpoint calculator, these changes are quite substantial, especially if you take them in the context of all the other changes made to our weapons and the partial damage mechanic. For example, theoretically, a Liberator Penetrator should be able to one-shot a Scavenger within 10 meters, which for a weapon with a very limited magazine is a big deal. This also means weapons like the Diligence Counter-Sniper are able to pick off hunters with a single shot from a good distance away, making it much more ammo efficient against enemy types you'd normally never bring a marksman rifle against. Small change on paper, but it has bigger implications for the pace of combat and breakpoints, especially since these are very common enemies to fight in swarms. Bile Titans have had their belly armor reduced from medium 2 to light 2, the same as any pleb bug enemy. This basically means you can use any weapon to burst its belly open to stop it from spewing bile on you, which is in some circumstances really good, because if you die and you come back without a support weapon, all you're going to have to rely on is your primary weapon. In addition to that, once you've popped its belly, it now has a separate belly health pool, which will kill the Bile Titan if it's destroyed. In other words, with enough effort and ammo, you can bring a Bile Titan down with any weapon. A complete 180 from the Bile Titans that were before the patch, where you basically couldn't kill it unless you had at least heavy 1 penetration, or AP5. Finally, we're going to briefly talk about some stratagem changes. In short, every stratagem that was capable of dealing damage to heavy units have had their damage increased to support a similar or higher power level. Some changes specific to stratagems beyond just the damage buff include the Eagle 500 kilo bomb explosive radius has been increased. It is now pretty big and the knockback radius is huge too. I recommend being a safe distance away now, no more standing 15 meters away from the blast radius and being unaffected. The Emancipator Exosuit has had its autocannon durable damage increased from 60 to 150, a 2.5 times improvement. In addition to this damage buff, its rate of fire and the total ammo per arm has also been increased. These changes will make the Emancipator much better to use instead of the Nerf slinging toy that it was before. The Orbital Gas Strike has basically been changed in terms of mechanics. In preparation for the Chemical Agent's Warbond, gas will now be focused on crowd control, dealing blindness and confusion to enemies and Helldivers alike, at the expense of reduced damage over time. This change is also so that fire damage has a more distinct role of dealing damage, as before, damage over time mechanics were pretty much the same across both fire and gas. If you are wondering what confusion looks like, well, here's a clip of some very confused bots shooting at things. Gas is going to lead to many comedic moments, I can feel it. Some key changes and fixes that came with this patch. Intense heat and extreme cold modifiers are no longer static throughout the mission and change based on the time of day and weather conditions. Some desert planets will only have the intense heat in the day and no modifier at night, or might even have extreme cold instead. Arid planets like Hellmire will only have the intense heat modifier active during tornado storms. I love all of these changes because it makes the game much more dynamic and more interesting as you progress throughout the mission and the time of day changes. Now, before I close out the video, here are some notable fixes that were included in the patch as well. They fixed enemies not receiving damage properly when more than 10 meters away from the player. I'm not exactly sure what this is referencing, but could it be the ghost damage that happens when you land a shot but no damage is dealt? Maybe. They also fixed an issue causing most weapons to shoot below the crosshair when ADS. They fixed an issue where Bile Titans may sometimes not take any damage to the head. The HMG scope is no longer misaligned. And finally, and importantly, General Brash democratic value has increased by 1000%. This was a much needed boost to increase the spirit of democracy. With that, we've come to the end of the video. This is certainly one of the best patches I've read in a while for any game. The amount of good news and excitement it generated was great, and I can't wait to get in the game and try these changes for myself. This alone was a good sign for the overall reception of this patch, and that's something Arrowhead really needed, reigniting the excitement for their game and the fun it will bring. I'll do a proper post-patch review sometime after I've gotten a few games down. I'll give my thoughts and opinions about the state of the game post-patch then. Until then, I'll see you in the next video. Over and out, Helldivers.